verb system, look at some of the passives. Mainly going to be looking at the aorist passive, the theta eta verb form. I know this is morphology and probably some people are going to have their eyes glaze over, but if you hang with me, there's some really good payoff here in terms of exegesis and understanding how the Greek verb system, the voice system works. Basically what we have in most morphology charts is kind of a tripartite system in the with the aorist. You have the active, middle, and then what's considered passive. The problem is there are a large category of these passives that are considered deponent. They're essentially passive in meaning but active in function, or passive in inflection, active in meaning. And so the question is, what do we do with that? And typically we follow the lead from Latin and just dealt with them as an anomaly. But some examples of these would be on your handout. So you have, in each of these cases, the grammatical subject is acting as the agent. You don't have, they're not, they're the ones who are doing the action. And so the question is, how can this be passive if they're the ones who are doing it? If we go back to the chart, voice systems tend to act more as a continuum rather than a box. We've already talked a little bit already about the messiness of language and the overlapping, and voice is no different from that. So if we have a high transitivity, most agent-like end of the spectrum and a most patient-like and less transitive end of the spectrum, essentially what you have is these passive forms are jumping over the middle, and you would not expect to have one form that far down the continuum doing double duty. Doesn't say it can't happen, but it would not be what we'd expect or should expect from linguistic typology. Instead, what we have is more of a gradation, where you go from most agent-like to most patient-like, and the non-passives then are understood. What had been a non-passive in that kind of tripartite system would be a less transitive set of middles. And that what we're looking at, in fact, is something quite like what we find in the present and the perfect, but that you have a division of labor within the middle and passive forms, with theta eta taking the lower transitivity end of the middles. From this standpoint, the way you would identify a passive is not the verb's morphology in isolation, but would be the presence of an explicit agent in the context. So a hupo or a by X, where you have an explicit agent supplied that disambiguates that it's not middle. We'll come back to this in a little bit, but I mean that's kind of the theory we're working with, or the principles we'd be working with. So let's introduce semantic roles to kind of help gain some insight. Probably, fairly self-explanatory ideas of agent and patient, but from a formal standpoint. So this would be cognitive grammar, Ronald Langeker's work. We've simplified it somewhat, but that would be the literature we'd be building for or drawing upon. But the agent, from a semantic standpoint, is considered the energy source, the initiator, where things begin, and that energy is then transferred, and it's going to manifest itself differently depending on the event type of the verb. So an actual transitive verb of passing or moving something is going to have a literal energy we can see, but with verbs, experiential verbs like shame or embarrassment, those are going to be causing something on someone else. You're not going to have a literal movement of some kind. But the patient then is the energy endpoint. And so you have this basic semantic role. So let's add some different event types. So if I was talking about moving the water, I'm the energy initiator, the starting point. The water is the end point. So we have the roles laid out. If I say I broke the smart screen, which I hope I would not do, the action has resulted in a change of state with the screen going from working to broken. I'm still the agent, I'm still the initiator of the action, but instead of shifting and moving something, we've got a change of state. And finally, the experiencer. If I cause someone to be embarrassed, again, I'm the initiator of that. The person who's embarrassed is the recipient of that. You still have that same basic metaphor of energy transfer. So if we come back to voice and look at that, with an active voice, you still have these two distinct roles of agent and patient. But the agent, since it's the source of energy, is naturally the more salient of the two, and based on that, ends up, in most cases, becoming the default subject, which is what the active voice represents. It's having the agent be the grammatical subject, puts the spotlight on them. When we move to a passive verb, you still have the two distinct roles, you still have the two distinct participants, but all you've done is shift the spotlight onto the patient, and that's where you also have the possibility of essentially alighting the agent rather than using a by or hoopall kind of expression, which leads people to claim the divine agency and these are the divine passives and these kinds of things. That's an exegetical question, but the point is you still have two distinct roles in terms of how things are conceptualized. What about the middle? The middle, you've gone from two separate participants. You still have the same roles, but they've been conflated upon the same participant. And as a result of that, you have no competition between that second participant because you only have one. By definition, middle voice verbs are intransitive. So what you've done with the middle is the subject is the initiator of the action, but also the recipient, the end point of the action. Now, we've tried to capture this in English using active voice verbs with a reflexive, but we need to recognize that Greek has the very same combination, like in Galatians 1:4 about Christ offering himself for us. So that's not capturing the middle voice very well if Greek has that same kind of distinction. But let's go back to our examples with the bridesmaids getting up. Now if we think about it from a Greek perspective, the Greeks would say, how can I get up without being affected by my action? You know, I'm the one doing the action, but if I had an agent, if I was an agent causing something to move, it would be a causative thing because I'm not the recipient of the energy. If I'm the endpoint of the energy, you're going to end up with, again, you look at our verbs of motion, erchomai, paruomai, deomai, they're all middles, and a Greek would say, what's wrong with that? What else would I do? That's our problem is the mismatch between Greek and English. And it's not to say that we should have all figured this out because we don't have that. So if you have learned Spanish, Spanish has a middle. It behaves remarkably like Greek. So the metaphor of the beginning point and end point has been useful for me in understanding kind of what's going on and to think through each of these. So we've got a verb of mental states, looking at considering things. Again, someone else may have prompted them to consider this, but it's still, they're the initiator of that, but they're also receiving the effects of that. It's not a reflexive of going out and coming back. The point is they're the starting point and the end point. So if we come back to this scale, what we see with theta eta is, again, this division of labor. So within the middle voice, rather than them functioning as a passive, because from a linguistic standpoint, the passives can't be distinguished on the basis of verbal morphology alone. You need the presence of an explicit agent of some kind. And that rather than having these be specific categories, the notion of active, the sigmatic middle, these are more like waypoints along the spectrum rather than stark divisions. and that we think in terms of prototype as what's most prototypical, because we actually can have things like Luke 8:33, where you have an intransitive active. How can that happen? Well, Greek doesn't. That's welcome to the messiness of language. They rush headlong. There is no recipient. There is no other endpoint for the action. Yet it's an active. And what I found most interesting. We'll jump ahead to the conclusions about this. This really sounds crazy. How did we miss this? I think part of it is our willingness that there's a ready solution in Latin with these defective forms and the mismatch with English. I think it's quite natural. But as things have progressed in terms of Diane Kimmer's work, Rutger Allen's work in classics, and understanding semantic roles and how these things fit together, we finally have some additional help for us that don't have a natural understanding of active. The most significant thing I found in reading through the author Rachel Aubrey's paper on this was there are two kinds of systems in the world. There's an active-passive system, which is what English would represent, and an active middle. Active-passive systems are derivational, meaning if I have a passive form, there must be an active form, because the way I create the passive is to detransitivize it. I make it an intransitive form. So the presence of a passive obligates the presence of an active, the existence of an active. In an active middle system, you don't have that requirement. It's non-derivational, which explains why we have middle only in Greek. But again, assuming this is correct, it behaves like an active middle system, where you have middle onlys and active onlys, because it's a non-derivational system. The question is, well, how can we have missed that theta eta is middle instead of passive? Again, because it fits over at the passive end, and people that are still arguing this, I ran into Coulter George in Oxford, and he had just finished a book on agency, so he was very vehemently arguing in favor of this because it's a tidy system. But when theta eta first arose back in Homeric Greek, it was only used for middle forms. So if we think of this in terms of gang metaphor, the theta eta started taking over. The first thing they did was they headed down and handled the passive area, which is what we see in the Koine period. But by the time you come to the Roman period, and even late Koine, it's encroaching upon the sigmatic aorists. And by the time you come to the Roman period, there is no sigmatic middle anymore. Theta eta, you have the same kind of two-part voice system as you have in the present and the perfect. So historically, this fits. It's just the difficulty is recognizing a division of labor within the middle system. So the takeaway from this is there are probably a lot more middle forms in our Bibles than our morphology would lead us to believe. Rachel's paper I would commend to you. It's in the forthcoming volume, but in terms of learning the event types, that's going to be the key. If you have 6 or 8 of those, that provides that kind of tool belt for you to draw upon to look at the different lemmas as you're doing your exegesis and doing your analysis, to know how these different event types are going to behave, if that makes sense. So it's not requiring you to go off and get an additional degree in semantics. I've put that off, and I continue to put that off. But this would be the way to bootstrap your way in without having to invest all that in